Professional driving schools shows that they use more of our cars.
We laughed, we danced, we wore glitter and polyester like armor, yet somehow the strangest joys of the 1970s quietly vanished while we weren't looking. What weird little wonder did we lose? And why does remembering it feel like coming home to a life we forgot we loved? They were not just colors. They were a mood, a way of life, a national obsession. If your family had a refrigerator, oven, or even a stand mixer in the 1970s, chances are it was proudly painted in avocado green or harvest gold. These colors seeped into American homes like smoke through an open window, subtle at first, then absolutely everywhere. They were earthy, comforting, and oddly futuristic, somehow both natural and synthetic, like they belonged in your grandmother's farmhouse and on a spaceship at the same time. These weren't just appliances. They were statements. And if you grew up opening a Harvest Gold refrigerator to grab a can of orange soda, you remember how right it felt, even if it clashed with everything else in the room. What makes it funny now is how seriously everyone took it, how confidently we wrapped our whole kitchens in two shades that looked like mustard and guacamole got in a fight. But there's something nostalgic in it too. That avocado green stove wasn't just where your parents cooked dinner, it's where you waited to hear the pop of the popcorn, or watched your mom's hand-me-down casserole bubble under tinfoil. That color wasn't a design choice, it was the background of your life. They clacked, they thudded, they echoed across school hallways and suburban sidewalks like someone dropped a toolbox full of maracas. Clogs were not just shoes, they were the sound of the 1970s growing louder with every step. Imported in spirit from the Netherlands but reimagined in American malls, these wooden-soled shoes made fashion louder, literally. Kids wore them, parents wore them, teachers wore them, and then regretted it halfway through the school day. There was no sneaking around in clogs. They announced you like a drumline at a parade. But they were sturdy, comfortable, if you got used to them, and they felt weirdly rebellious. Like your feet were telling the world, yeah, I'm gonna be loud about it. Maybe they were impractical. Maybe they didn't match anything you owned, but they looked good with bell bottoms. And in a decade that was all about expression, clogs didn't whisper. They stomped. The funny part is how seriously we took them, like wearing a chunk of painted wood strapped to your foot was the height of elegance. But back then, it was. And if you grew up in that era, you remember how it felt to hear your own footsteps echo through the mall food court like you were walking across the moon. It started with a blank mesh canvas, a plastic hook, and a tangle of brightly colored yarn that somehow always ended up in knots. But to a kid, or even a bored adult, in the 1970s, latch hook rugs were more than just crafts. They were a challenge, a hobby, a rainy day savior. And they turned every living room into an art studio, every kid into a pixelated painter of shaggy masterpieces. Maybe it was a rainbow, a unicorn, a cartoon tiger, or just some wild geometric pattern that looked way better in your head. Either way, the finished product hung on your wall with pride, your very own DIY fiber art. It did not matter that it shed more than the family dog or that the corners curled after a week. You made it. You hooked every tuft. You stabbed that canvas like a warrior with a mission. Looking back, it is funny how latch hook rugs turned an entire generation into tiny weavers with zero idea what they were doing. But there was something almost meditative about it, something calming in the repetition, something weirdly profound in pulling strand after strand through the mesh while the Brady Bunch played in the background. No screens, no phones, just you, your yarn, and a dream. Walk through one, and you were instantly transported into another room, another vibe, another world. Beaded door curtains were not just home decor, they were portals. 1 second, you were in the hallway. The next, you were in your older sister's bedroom, where incense was burning and David Bowie was staring from the wall like a glittery prophet. The soft clatter of beads colliding became a soundtrack all its own. And you could never sneak through them, no matter how hard you tried. They were the tattletales of the 1970s, every clink a betrayal, every sway a confession. but they were also beautiful. Cheap, colorful, exotic in a way that felt grown up. You bought them at head shops, flea markets, or that one aisle in Woolworths that always smelled like patchouli. Whether they were made of bamboo, plastic, or little wooden cylinders painted to look like sunsets, beaded curtains promised something magical beyond them, something adult, something groovy, and everyone had them, or wanted them. The funny thing is how useless they were at actually dividing rooms or providing privacy. But who cared? In a time when the house was your kingdom and your bedroom was your castle, beaded curtains were your drawbridge. You could hear it in the first note. Sunshine Pop was like opening a window in your soul and letting the summer breeze in. It was not just music, it was a feeling. Bright, bouncy, unreasonably optimistic. The harmonies stacked like pancakes, the melodies sparkled like soda fizz, and everything about it made you want to roll down a grassy hill and laugh for no reason. You may not remember every lyric, but you remember how it made you feel. Like anything was possible and everything was going to be okay. Even if you were 10 and the world was just your backyard and your mom's burnt grilled cheese. Bands like The Fifth Dimension and The Association sang in choruses that felt like hugs. Up, Up and Away was not just a song, it was a rocket ship made of brass and harmonies. The funny part is how relentlessly happy it all was. Unapologetically cheerful. Like it knew the world was a mess but chose joy anyway. It might sound cheesy now, maybe even a little naive. But back then it felt like hope. And even if it only lasted 3 minutes, that hope was everything. It buzzed, it pulsed, it barely made sense. Minimal wave was not made for sing-alongs or car radios. It was made for empty rooms, lit by green fluorescent lights and lonely kids who wanted to feel like machines. Stripped down, bare, cold, and perfect, this was the birth of synth music, and it did not ask for your approval. It just started humming in the background of the late 1970s like a glitch in the system. While disco dominated the airwaves and arena rock-filled stadiums, minimal wave snuck in through the basement. Quiet, awkward, and strangely magnetic. The synthesizers were raw, the drum machines were stiff, and the vocals? Half-spoken, half-sung, all emotion buried under static. But somehow, it worked. It was hypnotic. It was weirdly beautiful in the way a broken radio can be beautiful. And for the misfits, the loners, the kids who did not see themselves in glitter and leather, minimal wave was a new kind of mirror. The funny part is how ahead of its time it was. Nobody knew that in 10 years everyone would be chasing that sound. But if you were there at the beginning, it felt like a secret the future had whispered just to you. Sequins and leather, smudged eyeliner and busted amps, glam punk was the glorious, greasy collision of everything too beautiful and too angry to fit in. It took the sparkle of glam rock and smashed it into the snarling mouth of punk, and what came out was electric. The New York Dolls looked like they fell out of a glitter bomb during a street fight. They strutted and screamed, smeared with makeup, wearing heels and ripped fishnets, flipping the bird at every rule in music and fashion. This was not about perfection, it was about presence, about noise, about guts. Glam punk walked like it owned the stage and did not care if it fell off. It was funny, too, how seriously it made fun of itself. There was always a wink behind the mascara, a joke in every riff. But underneath the chaos was something real, something raw, a message wrapped in tinsel and distortion. Be loud, be weird, be ugly and beautiful at the same time. In a world trying to package you into neat little boxes, glam punk kicked the boxes over and danced on top of them in platform boots. It sounded like mariachi horns over a guitar solo. It felt like a backyard cookout mixed with a garage concert. Chicano rock was not just music, it was resistance, pride, a celebration. Born from Mexican-American communities and stitched together with rhythm, blues, Latin beats, and American rock, this genre gave voice to generations caught between cultures. It was the soundtrack of identity, of straddling two worlds and singing from both. Bands like El Chicano and Tierra turned that tightrope walk into an anthem, melodies that carried history in every chord, and they played with heart, soul, grit. You could hear the roots in every note and still dance to it with a plate of rice and beans in your hand. The funny part is how invisible it was to the mainstream for so long, how something so vibrant, so loud could be so overlooked. But if you were part of the community, it was everywhere. At parties, on radios, echoing from lowriders cruising the boulevard. Chicano rock did not just blend genres, it blended generations. It told stories no one else was telling. And it proved that music, like identity, could be layered, complicated, and absolutely electrifying. It did not care if you understood it, it just made your body move in ways you did not know it could. Avant Funk was funk turned inside out. Grooves turned jagged, rhythms fractured on purpose, like someone spliced James Brown with a malfunctioning robot. But it worked. It should not have, but it did. You had Parliament Funkadelic bending time with bass lines. You had the talking heads layering existential dread over a dance beat. And in the middle of it all, you had this creeping realization. This is weird, and I love it. Avant Funk was the sound of boundaries breaking. It said, "You thought music had to make sense? Watch this." It was sarcastic, sly, totally unapologetic, and it made you move anyway, even if you were confused, especially if you were confused. The funny thing is how it never quite got labeled properly. It lived in the cracks between genres, too slippery to pin down, too bold to ignore. It made you want to dance and then sit down and question your life. In the best way. They were not just vehicles. They were dreams on wheels, decked out in shag carpet and questionable murals of wizards and wolves. Vansploitation films took the freedom and rebellion of the open road and turned it into cinematic chaos. The plot usually did not matter. A guy, a girl, a van, and a summer full of terrible decisions, that was enough. The Van in 1977 set the tone, a teenage fantasy of cruising, partying, and trying to look cool while living in your car. And people loved it. Because those vans were more than transportation. They were rolling bedrooms, bars, escape pods. They had curtains. They had couches. Some had lava lamps. If you were lucky, yours had an 8-track player and speakers in the back. The funny part is how deeply uncool it looks now. But at the time, it was everything. Independence, adventure, privacy. For a generation raised on rules, the van was a loophole with fuzzy dice on the mirror. Roller disco was not just a hobby, it was a way of becoming someone else for a night. You laced up your skates like you were putting on a costume, stepped into that pulsating rink, and suddenly you were untouchable. The music was always booming, Donna Summer, Chic, Bee Gees, and the lights spun like wild stars trapped in a mirrored galaxy. The disco ball wasn't just decoration, it was a lighthouse, a guidepost, a disco deity above your head as you twirled in polyester. Whether you were gliding like a pro or holding onto the rail for dear life, you were part of the show. Everyone was. Because it wasn't just about the moves, it was about the vibe. The outfits were louder than the music. Metallic pants, crop tops, rainbow suspenders, headbands slick with sweat. You didn't have to be good, you just had to be in. And when the whole rink synced to the beat, it felt like the world was healing itself, one backwards crossover at a time. The funny part? Most of us fell more than we skated. But no one cared. You'd laugh, crawl back up, and keep going. Because the floor was freedom, and for one glorious hour, under those spinning lights, nothing else mattered. Show and tell felt like technology from another planet, and if you were a kid in the 1970s, it basically was. A boxy contraption with the soul of a film projector and the heart of a storybook. It let you do something incredible. Watch a movie while listening to a record, all in your very own living room. You didn't need a teacher, you didn't need a classroom, you just needed one of those magical little cartridges, half plastic, half mystery, and the willingness to sit still. It would whir to life with a soft hum, the narrator's voice crackling through the speakers, and as the images scrolled across the tiny screen, it felt like the future. One minute you were listening to fairy tales, and the next you were exploring outer space or solving mysteries with a cartoon detective. It was hands-on. It was immersive. It was mesmerizing. Sure, the film sometimes jammed, and yes, the sound occasionally skipped, but who cared? The show and tell turned dull afternoons into cinematic adventures. It made learning feel like fun before anyone thought to market learning as fun. The funny thing is, it was clunky, primitive. But back then, it was everything. A personal theater, powered by your own tiny hands and imagination. Blacklight posters weren't just wall art. They were like secret messages to your future self, glowing with untamed energy in bedrooms lit by nothing but neon. You'd close the door, switch on the blacklight bulb, and the entire room transformed. Tigers snarled in ultraviolet orange, mushrooms shimmered with galactic pink, and skeletons danced across velvet paper like ghosts at a cosmic rave. You didn't need to be a teenager to love them, but you definitely felt like one the moment you saw one. They were psychedelic, electric, and sometimes downright disturbing. And that was the point. These posters weren't meant to calm you down. They were meant to blow your mind. Every friend who visited your room would stand and stare, half laughing, half lost in the glowing madness. You didn't always understand what you were looking at, and somehow that made it cooler. They were rebellious in their own quiet way. Too weird for the living room, too loud for the hallway, but perfect for the sacred space that was your bedroom. Looking back, it's funny how seriously we took them. But at the time, they were more than just decorations. They were personality printed in phosphorescence. It was the kind of madness only the 1970s could have invented. Strip down, sprint across a public space, and somehow make it feel like a movement. Streaking wasn't just a prank, it was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. And at its peak, it was happening everywhere. College campuses, football fields, live television broadcasts. You'd be mid-sentence or mid-cheer, and boom. Someone zipped by in nothing but sneakers and bravery, trailing shock and giggles in their wake. It wasn't about indecency. It was about absurdity, rebellion, the raw human need to scream, "I exist," in the weirdest way possible. And as strange as it sounds, it brought people together. Total strangers would burst into laughter, point, cheer, and for a second forget everything serious. Forget Nixon, forget bills, forget the fact that dinner was Spam again. Streaking turned the world into a stage, and the performer didn't need a script. Just guts. It's funny now how casual it was, how a naked sprint through a graduation ceremony could end in applause. But maybe that was the beauty of it. The 1970s weren't always glamorous, but they were alive. Wildly, ridiculously alive. TV dinners were more than food. They were a revolution in a foil tray. You'd pull one from the freezer, peel back the corner, and slide it into the oven with a hope and a prayer. 25 minutes later, you had dinner. Kind of. The mashed potatoes were crusty on one side and icy on the other. The gravy had merged with the corn. And that chocolate brownie in the corner? A molten rock capable of scorching the roof of your mouth until Tuesday. But none of that mattered, because you got to eat on a metal tray in the living room while watching All in the Family. You didn't need to set the table. You didn't need to talk. TV dinners gave families a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to be alone together. The funny part is how futuristic they felt, even though they were never that good. But they were consistent, they were easy. And in a time when everyone was juggling work, inflation, and nuclear anxiety, convenience was king. We laugh now. But we kept buying them, because they gave us time. And that, back then, was worth more than taste. Beanbag chairs were anti-furniture. They didn't care about structure, design, or lumbar support. They just wanted you to plop down, sink in, and forget your bones existed. They came in colors that didn't match anything. Burnt orange, pea green, electric blue, and textures that felt like cheap dreams. Vinyl usually, sometimes velvet, always squeaky. You didn't sit on a beanbag. You disappeared into it. For kids, they were a throne. For teens, a nest. For adults, a regrettable purchase they kept anyway. They made you feel like you were living in a space-age lounge or the back room of a groovy record store. They weren't just chairs, they were rebellion in blob form. Beanbags made rooms feel like clubs or crash pads. No corners, no edges, just wobbling, sagging piles of synthetic comfort. They were everywhere: basements, dorms, bedrooms, game rooms. And the moment you fell into one, you stopped caring about anything else. That was the trick. The funny part? They were impossible to get out of gracefully. You didn't stand, you rolled, you crawled, you clawed at the air like you were escaping quicksand. But that was part of the charm. Beanbag chairs didn't try to be elegant, they were honest. Honest about what the 1970s really needed: a place to collapse, decompress, and just vibe out. Pong was the big bang of video games, an origin story wrapped in pixelated silence and digital tension. 2 paddles, 1 square ball. No levels, no story, no characters, just pure, unfiltered challenge. And yet, it consumed us. You could play for hours, trying to outlast your sibling or beat your high score. The beep when you missed was devastating. The sound of the bounce, hypnotic. It was electronic tennis for people who didn't know they needed electronic tennis. Pong made your television do something new, something personal, interactive. You weren't just watching, you were playing, controlling, competing. It felt futuristic, like you were controlling electricity with your thumbs. And when you won, it was not just a game, it was a triumph. And that changed everything. The funny part? It barely did anything, but it did enough. Enough to spark a multi-billion-dollar industry. Enough to prove that simple could be powerful. It turned coffee tables into battlefields and parents into reluctant players. Pong was the first taste. And once you had it, you knew something big had started. Clackers were dangerous, but that just made them better. 2 acrylic spheres tethered by string, daring you to swing them so perfectly they'd smack together in a perfect rhythm. When you got it right, magic. When you didn't, bruises. Every playground in the 1970s echoed with the unmistakable clack, clack, clack of kids testing their reflexes and pushing their luck. You'd time your swings, adjust your grip, and pray your fingers didn't get caught. There were no rules, no instructions, just noise and adrenaline. They were toys with consequences, which somehow made them cooler. Every mark left behind was worn like a badge of honor. Clackers were banned in some schools, feared by parents, but that only added to their mystique. You weren't just playing, you were proving something. You could handle it. You had skills, or at least, you were brave enough to try. The funny part? We kept buying them, breaking them, and begging for more. Clackers weren't safe, but they were unforgettable. That little yellow smile was everywhere, on buttons, bumper stickers, t-shirts, notebooks. It told you to have a nice day, like it actually meant it. And in the weird, wonderful chaos of the 1970s, people needed that message more than ever. The smiley face wasn't just a graphic, it was a lifeline. A gentle rebellion against cynicism. A neon-colored handshake that said, "We're gonna be okay." You'd see it at gas stations, on lunchboxes, on pins stuck to shaggy denim jackets. Even if you didn't believe it, you wanted to. That face was a bright yellow lie we all agreed to live inside. It was corny. It was sincere. It was perfect. It made you feel like someone, somewhere still had hope. And maybe that meant you could too. The funny thing? It worked. That dumb little face made people smile back. In an age of protest, polyester, and disco, the smiley face was the simplest joy. And sometimes, that's all we needed. Earth shoes didn't look right. That's what made them revolutionary. With the heel lower than the toe, they were designed to realign your body and fix the damage done by a lifetime of modern footwear. They weren't sleek. They weren't cute. They were clunky, wide, and proud of it. But for those who wore them, they were a revelation. Every step felt grounded, rooted, like walking backwards into better health. Earth shoes were part of a bigger movement, back to the land, back to basics, back to something real. They looked like something a hobbit might wear, but that just made them feel natural. Walking in them felt like choosing your body over fashion for the first time. Hippies loved them. So did health freaks, spiritual seekers, and that one aunt who taught yoga before yoga was cool. The funny part? They worked. Kind of. Enough people swore by them that they became more than a fad. They were a quiet protest against fast fashion, against bad posture, against a world too busy to stop and think. Earth Shoes said, "Slow down, feel the earth." And for a little while, we did. The Gong Show wasn't just a variety show. It was pure, beautiful chaos, live on national television. You never knew what you were about to see. A guy balancing bananas on his head? Sure. A woman playing Stairway to Heaven on a kazoo while hula hooping? Of course. Hosted by the half-smirking, always on the verge of losing it Chuck Barris, it was part talent show, part circus, part fever dream. Contestants came from nowhere and left in confusion, often interrupted by a deafening gong mid-act. And yet, no one seemed to care. In fact, getting gonged off the stage became part of the fun. It was a badge of honor. The audience loved it. The judges loved it. Even the performers laughed along, usually wearing something absurd. It was the 1970s in one loud, sloppy, joyfully unfiltered hour. You didn't need to be good, you just needed to be brave, or strange, or both. The Gong Show wasn't polished like today's talent competitions. It was raw, spontaneous, kind of dangerous in a glittery, let's see what happens way. And somehow, in its sheer weirdness, it felt more honest than anything else on television. The funny thing is, looking back, the show makes no sense. But that's exactly why it worked. It didn't follow a script, it followed a vibe. It let America's weirdos shine, even if just for 30 seconds before the mallet dropped. And for that brief moment, every oddball with a dream felt like a star. You might remember Ronald McDonald, but in the 1970s, he wasn't running the show alone. He had help, or maybe company, from a cast of characters so bizarre, so cartoonishly surreal, they felt like they belonged in a Salvador Dali painting directed by Jim Henson. Mayor McCheese with his oversized cheeseburger head and mayoral sash. Grimace, a purple blob with no clear origin or purpose, who might have been a milkshake or a living gumdrop. And the Hamburglar, a masked menace in a striped outfit who only ever said "robble robble." These weren't just mascots, they were marketing fever dreams brought to life. And kids loved them. They weren't realistic, they weren't logical, but they were unforgettable. They appeared in commercials, Happy Meal toys, playgrounds, and birthday parties. The McDonald's Land Gang was a kind of fast food mythology, a goofy, unsettling, brightly colored world where French fries grew on trees and hamburgers needed political representation. It was weird, but it worked. It worked so well that entire generations grew up thinking Grimace was their friend and the Hamburglar was a hilarious criminal. The funny part? No one ever questioned it. You just accepted that your cheeseburger came with a side of mayors and purple monsters. And somehow, that made it taste better. In a world full of rules and rationing, McDonald's Land was a lawless place where ketchup was currency and imagination was king. Ktel compilation records were the audio equivalent of a late-night impulse buy, and for many of us, they were our first true taste of music ownership. The commercials were hypnotic. A dramatic voiceover would say something like, 40 original hits by the original stars, while song titles flashed across the screen faster than your brain could process. These weren't carefully curated albums. They were chaotic, crammed with as many tracks as humanly possible. And because of that, the songs were often hilariously edited. Verses cut short, fades sped up. Sometimes it felt like the entire song was gasping for air before getting shoved into the next one. But we didn't care, we loved them. These records gave you Queen, the Bee Gees, Donna Summer, and Hall & Oates, all in one glorious package with a cover that looked like it was designed during a sugar rush. Ktel albums were the Spotify playlists of the 1970s, only they skipped, popped, and warped if you left them in the sun. You'd listen to them in your bedroom with a pair of giant headphones plugged into a turntable the size of a suitcase, and every song felt like a treasure. The funny part? These albums weren't respected. Music snobs mocked them, but they sold like crazy because they weren't about perfection. They were about fun, fast, loud, and a little sloppy, just like the decade that birthed them. You heard it before you saw it. that distant, tinny melody echoing through the neighborhood like a siren made of sugar and dreams. The ice cream truck, just a few warped notes of The Entertainer or Pop Goes the Weasel, and suddenly the entire block was in motion. Kids flung open screen doors, abandoned bikes mid-ride, and tore through the grass barefoot, holding sweaty coins in their palms like precious relics. There was no guarantee it was even coming down your street. Half the time, the sound was bouncing from 2 blocks over. But that didn't stop the chase. You ran like your life depended on it. And when the truck did show up, everything stopped. Adults paused lawn work, dogs barked in unison, and kids lined up in wild, chaotic rows to choose between rocket pops, push-ups, and those terrifying character bars with gumball eyes. The truck itself was a metal box on wheels, usually covered in fading decals and operated by someone who seemed both cheerful and mildly haunted. But none of that mattered, because the ice cream truck was magic. It was summer, independence, and bliss, all wrapped in a napkin that fell apart before you were halfway done. The funny part? Sometimes you didn't even want ice cream. You just wanted to chase something, to run toward a sound that promised happiness. And if you were lucky, it delivered, dripping and melting and worth every penny. Television in the 1970s wasn't just something you watched. It was something you adjusted, wrestled, and pleaded with. Every household had rabbit ears, those spindly metal antennas perched like insect limbs on top of the TV. And if the picture went fuzzy or the screen filled with static, you didn't call for help. You got up. You grabbed the antennas like you were performing some ancient ritual, and you waved them in the air, tilting them just so. Sometimes you held one and made yourself part of the circuit. Sometimes you had to wrap them in foil or jam a wire hanger in there just to get the evening news. And when the signal came in crystal clear, everyone in the room would freeze. Don't breathe, don't move, just let it play. It was teamwork, it was hope, it was ridiculous, but it was normal. Adjusting the antenna was a shared experience, something every family did, often with one person crouched behind the set while another yelled, "It's better? No, wait, go back." The funny part? It worked just enough to keep trying. This wasn't passive viewing, it was active survival. And when the picture finally locked in, when your favorite show wasn't snow-covered and the audio matched the lips, you felt like you had won something. You earned that episode. You fought for that rerun. And somehow, that made it even better. Shoulder pads were not just a fashion choice. They were a power move. In the 80s, women were stepping into boardrooms, climbing corporate ladders, and making sure they were seen, and their clothes spoke volumes. Blazers were built like armor, structured to demand respect. It was fashion designed to take up space. For the first time, silhouettes were not about softness. They were about strength. Joan Collins and Linda Evans on Dynasty made it glamorous. Real-life professionals made it revolutionary. Women wanted to be taken seriously in a world that still doubted their presence. And what better way to announce yourself than with broad shoulders and bold suits? These outfits said, "I am here, I am not afraid, and I have earned my place." Skirts got shorter, heels got higher, and ambition got louder. You could hear it in the clack of pumps on polished floors. You could see it in the structured cuts of every outfit on Wall Street. This was more than fashion. It was feminist defiance wrapped in fabric. And underneath all that padding was the undeniable truth. Women were rewriting the rules. One outfit at a time. Power dressing did not just make a statement, it became the voice. Screwed directly into the wall, these heavy-duty wall-mounted can openers were as stubborn as they were convenient. Usually found right next to the stove or sink, they were the type of kitchen gadget you used without thinking, until you bumped your head into one or sliced your finger trying to clean it. You locked in the can, turned the large handle, and heard that satisfying scrape as the lid peeled away. And it never moved. That was the point. It was always there, ready to go. Back then, cans did not have pop-tops, and handheld openers were prone to rust or breaking. So this chunky mechanical beast became part of the kitchen wall like a light switch. It made even the smallest task feel intentional, like you were part of a well-oiled machine. And it never broke, because it was made to be used, not replaced. Some people even bragged about how fast they could open a can of tomato soup. But as kitchens modernized and designers chose clean lines over utility, wall-mounted can openers became kitchen fossils. They were ripped out and tossed away, their holes patched up and painted over. Now, most folks do not even recognize them. But if you ever find one, run your hand along the gear teeth. It might just stir something in you. Why did we stop building things to stay put? Stretch Armstrong looked like a superhero and felt like a bag of rubber cement. And that is why we loved him. This was not a stiff plastic action figure with a gimmick. This was a toy you could actually wrestle. Stretch his arms across the room, twist his legs into knots, tie him in a bow, and he would always bounce back. No matter what you did, he never broke. Well, unless you were one of the unlucky few who found out what was really inside, a mysterious goo that made a mess you would never forget. But that was the risk, the thrill. It felt like you had your own indestructible sidekick, part science experiment, part best friend. You were not just playing with a toy, you were testing the limits of physics in your bedroom. Stretch Armstrong was more than a toy. He was a test. Could you push him further than your friends? Could you stretch him longer than the last time? For many kids, he was the one toy that felt indestructible, like a friend who could take any hit and never complain. He lived in closets, under beds, wrapped around lampposts and table legs. Now, he lives in memories and retro collectors' shelves. Why do we remember a rubber man with such strange affection long after the elastic gave out? The shopping mall was more than a place to buy things. It was the beating heart of teenage life. You did not just go to the mall, you lived there. It was where you met your friends, saw your crush, and discovered who you wanted to be. The food court was your kingdom. The arcade was your battleground. And the record store? That was your soul. Malls in the 80s were social cathedrals built from neon lights and polished tiles. You tried on clothes you could not afford. You loitered for hours. You flirted by the Orange Julius. And if you were lucky, your favorite store had a photo booth to capture the chaos. Escalators became runways. Hallways were arenas of style and identity. Whether it was Spencer's, The Gap, or Foot Locker, every store felt like its own little world. You were not just shopping, you were performing. The mall was your stage. Your friends were your co-stars. And the soundtrack? A steady stream of synth pop and laughter echoing off the glass. It was where friendships began and hearts broke, where trends were born and gossip spread faster than wildfire. In the 80s, the mall was not just a building, it was the center of the universe. Tucked quietly beneath the sink, the Undersink water heater was one of those features you never thought about, until it saved you 5 minutes in the morning. These little tanks provided instant hot water to just one faucet. Perfect for hand washing, quick dishes, or shaving if your sink doubled as a grooming station. Unlike the giant water heater in the basement, this one was small, efficient, and practically invisible. In homes where the main water heater was far away, these Undersink units made life easier. No waiting for hot water to snake through the pipes. But over time, centralized systems improved. Builders started planning homes with better plumbing routes. Energy efficiency standards changed, and these tiny tanks were declared unnecessary. Today, most have been removed or sit unplugged, collecting dust in old houses. But their legacy lives on in those first few seconds of hot water we all take for granted. Once, someone thought of that. Once, someone made it easier. When did we stop building for the little moments? Disco Demolition Night was not just a publicity stunt, it was a riot disguised as a baseball promotion. What began as a radio gag to blow up disco records in the middle of a Chicago White Sox game turned into chaos. Thousands stormed the field, fires burned, bats were stolen, the game was forfeited. But what happened that night was deeper than music. It was the sound of backlash. A backlash against disco, yes, but also against the communities that loved it. Against change, against color, against joy. Disco represented liberation. Gay clubs, black voices, women on the dance floor owning the beat. And in the summer of 1979, that scared some people. It was not just music under attack, it was people. The explosion on the field was a signal that joy had become too loud for some to tolerate. The explosion at Comiskey Park was not just about vinyl. It was about fear disguised as fun. The night left a crater, literal and cultural. Within a year, disco was pronounced dead. Radio stations changed formats. Record labels turned silent. But disco never died. It went underground. It evolved. It survived. Why do the loudest protests often come from those most afraid of the future? They were not just dolls. They were your children, adopted, named, cared for like living, breathing extensions of your heart. Cabbage Patch Kids exploded into American homes like nothing else before them. Chubby cheeks, yarn hair, signed bottoms, they were adorable and slightly strange. But they were yours. No two were the same. That was the magic. It felt personal, like fate. Parents fought in department stores to get them. Shelves emptied in seconds. News clips showed grown adults wrestling over plush plastic babies. It was not just a toy. It was a phenomenon. And it swept through the country like a fever dream. Kids brought them everywhere, to school, to bed, to dinner. They came with birth certificates and backstories, turning playtime into family drama. In an age of make-believe, these dolls made things feel real. The craze might sound ridiculous today, but in the moment, it was everything. A doll you had to adopt? That was not just marketing, it was genius. It made you feel responsible, important, part of something. And when the madness faded, what was left was a memory of wide-eyed joy, pure affection, and a little friend who made childhood feel alive. Long before streaming playlists and auto-suggestions, there was the record store, a sacred space, a sonic temple. You walked in and were greeted by walls lined with square-shaped dreams, vinyl sleeves with wild artwork, names you had heard, names you had not, and all of it waiting to be discovered. There was no algorithm to guide you, only curiosity. You flipped through crates like an archaeologist, hoping to find something that would blow your mind. The guy behind the counter knew everything, and he judged you, just a little, based on what you bought. That was part of the fun. You listened to albums in the store's listening booth, headphones on, heart racing. Maybe you found a bootleg live show. Maybe you found your new favorite band. Either way, you left with a paper bag full of possibility. Record stores were more than retail. They were communities. You met people there, you formed bands, you debated top 10 lists and learned which drummer really mattered. You did not just buy music, you became music. It was personal, tangible, real. And in the 80s, nothing felt cooler than walking home with a record under your arm, headphones in your bag, and your soundtrack for the week. Imagine opening your cabinet to plan dinner and seeing a chalkboard right on the inside of the door. Some even had pull-down recipe scrolls made of parchment or linen, mounted like an old-fashioned map. You could write a grocery list, the day's menu, or a reminder that your mother-in-law was coming over. These weren't just novelty features. They were part of how a kitchen thought out loud. In a time before smartphones or sticky notes, these were the planners, the notepads, the command centers of the kitchen. And they told a story. In chalk dust and grease smudges, you could see a family's week unfold. Sometimes the writing faded, but the memory of it never did. It was handwriting that knew your routines better than you did. Eventually, they faded out. Whiteboards came in, then apps, then voice memos. Cupboards no longer had messages waiting. Now, kitchens are silent and glossy, all smooth wood and cold steel. No one scribbles meatloaf tonight inside a drawer anymore. The charm is gone, and so is the handwriting. But in old kitchens, those chalk smears still whisper what once was. When did we stop writing things down where it mattered most? The hustle was not just a dance, it was a declaration that you were alive, stylish, and could move like liquid. It slid into clubs and wedding receptions alike, and if you were not doing it, you were watching it, waiting to learn. Disco brought the music, but the hustle gave it shape. It had rhythm, it had flash, and it had rules, but none too strict. It started in New York clubs, a mix of Latin footwork and soul flair, and spread like fire across the country. Couples spun and dipped with practiced ease, while groups snapped their fingers in unison, making ordinary people feel like stars. You could be shy all week and still own the room the second that beat dropped. The hustle made it okay to be dramatic, stylish, and totally unfiltered. For a while, the hustle was everywhere, on television shows, in gym class, even in living rooms, where kids tried it on shag carpeting and slid into coffee tables. The song told you to do it, and you did. Now it lives in nostalgic party playlists and throwback dance nights. But back then, it was the pulse of the weekend. The hustle taught a generation how to move together, even when the world outside felt disjointed. Why did a few steps and a catchy beat make us feel so connected, even if only for 3 minutes? The future did not arrive with a bang. It arrived in a beige plastic box that hummed quietly on a desk in the corner of your house. The Commodore 64, the Apple Macintosh. These were not just machines. They were portals into something entirely new. You typed, and the screen listened. You clicked, and doors opened. At first, it was simple. Word processors, floppy disks, a little green cursor blinking like it had a secret. But quickly, it became more. Games, learning, possibility. For kids, it was a playground. For parents, a tool. For dreamers, a revolution. It changed homework. It changed jobs. It changed you. That blinking cursor? It whispered that anything was possible. Families gathered around, just trying to figure it out together. The sound of a printer was like the future on paper. And the internet? Still a myth. Still a whisper. But you felt it coming. With every boot-up chime, every pixelated game, every painstaking keystroke, you were stepping into a new world. Personal computers did not just change technology. They changed lives. And for the first time ever, the future was not in a sci-fi movie. It was sitting on your desk. If your grandmother had a nutmeg grater drawer, you already know this was not about convenience. It was about pride. Tucked away like a secret compartment, this tiny wooden drawer usually had a built-in metal grater inside, fixed to the bottom or back wall. You would slide it open, pop in a whole nutmeg, and grate just enough to finish your pumpkin pie or rice pudding. It was oddly luxurious for such a tiny task. People swore that freshly grated nutmeg was leagues above the powdered kind from the store. And in kitchens that ran on rituals, this mattered. Nutmeg had a smell that meant something. Holidays, Sundays, a warm drink on a cold evening. It was the finishing touch, the kind of detail that showed you cared about flavor, not just filling bellies. One twist of that drawer and the kitchen felt instantly more personal. But as time went on, spice blends got pre-mixed, and the grater drawer seemed too specific for modern use. Most disappeared when newer cabinets came in. The metal rusted, the drawer warped, and eventually it was either nailed shut or tossed out with the old silverware. But once, it was a mark of a thoughtful kitchen, one where flavors came from effort, not a jar. Next time you taste store-bought eggnog, ask yourself, what tiny traditions did we leave behind? Pet rocks were the most absurd, brilliant, and completely sincere product of the 1970s. Imagine walking into a store and buying a rock. Not a toy that looked like a rock, an actual rock. And not just that, your new pet came in a box with straw bedding and a care manual. In a world spiraling through inflation, war, and cultural tension, Americans collectively decided to laugh. And they laughed by adopting a rock. The genius was not the object, but the moment. It was a wink to consumerism, a joke played perfectly straight. And yet, for some children, it became real. It was the kind of gag that somehow turned genuine, because it gave kids something stable in a world that felt anything but. For some families, it was the only pet they could afford. They named their rocks. They brought them to school. They carried them in pockets like loyal companions. Pet rocks sold by the millions. For a few dollars, you bought not just the item, but the idea that maybe life did not need to be so serious. Maybe in a world of chaos, you could still find control in something that literally never moved. They vanished as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind nothing but confused memories and collectors with original boxes. Why did something so silly feel like the most comforting purchase of the decade? Just say no. It was more than a slogan. It was a mantra, a moral line drawn in the sand. In the 80s, drugs were not just a problem. They were a threat looming over every school, every neighborhood, every dinner table conversation. Nancy Reagan's campaign marched into classrooms and television sets like a crusade. Posters went up, commercials played on loop, cartoon characters and celebrities told you to stay clean, stay strong, stay pure. It was earnest. It was relentless. It was everywhere. Kids got DARE shirts. Parents got pamphlets. Schools got visits from uniformed officers with serious faces and plastic bags full of crushed examples. And while it often felt simplified, even naive, the message was powerful. You had a choice, and you needed to make the right one. Some kids rolled their eyes. Some kids listened. But no one ignored it. The phrase burned itself into the cultural memory. Just say no was printed on binders, echoed in sitcoms, even used in rap lyrics. It became a symbol of the tension between fear and hope, between the reality of addiction and the dream of prevention. It did not solve everything, it could not, but it tried. And in a decade defined by big risks and even bigger consequences, sometimes all you had was the chance to say no and the hope that it would be enough. Warming drawers used to be the quiet hero of the kitchen, especially when dinner was not ready all at once. Tucked just below the oven, this thin, shallow drawer kept plates warm so that food would not go cold before it reached the table. You would set it to low, slide in your dishes, and when the roast came out, everything was ready to serve piping hot. This feature was a nod to formality. Meals meant something, and every detail mattered. Back then, no one wanted to pile roast beef onto a cold plate. But as life sped up and microwaves took over, warming drawers started disappearing. They took up space. They were easy to forget about. And soon, they felt like a relic of a more elegant time. Builders stopped including them in standard models, and even higher-end kitchens started to phase them out. Now, if you see one, it is usually mistaken for a storage drawer. But once, it meant warmth, literally and figuratively. It meant taking care, not just serving food. When did we stop setting the table like it was worth it? Shag carpeting was not just floor covering, it was a lifestyle choice. You did not walk across it, you sank into it. It came in colors no one had ever seen in nature: burnt orange, mustard yellow, electric blue, and it stretched wall to wall, daring you to find the floor beneath. Every house in the 1970s seemed to have it, and every child seemed to lose at least one toy inside it. It muffled footsteps. It held warmth. It made every room feel like a sunken lounge. Lying down on shag was like being hugged by the room itself. It made even silence feel plush. But shag had a downside. It trapped dust. It collected everything. It was impossible to clean. And yet, for all that, it felt luxurious, decadent, soft under bare feet during cartoons and cereal mornings. It was carpeting with an opinion. Now we look back and laugh at it. But once, it was a dream realized in fabric form. Why did we trade comfort that bold for floors that whisper and forget? Saturday mornings were sacred. You rolled out of bed in your pajamas, poured a sugary mountain of cereal, and turned on the television like it was a portal to another world. And what greeted you? Magic. Pure animated magic. Shows like He-Man, Transformers, DuckTales, and the Smurfs made those few hours feel like a festival of joy. These were not just cartoons, they were lifelines. The stories were bold, the heroes fearless, and the villains just scary enough to make victory feel earned. You learned about justice from turtles in bandanas, loyalty from robotic cars, and friendship from ponies with glittering eyes. Commercial breaks were an art form. The toys matched the shows, and the shows matched your dreams. This was marketing fused with myth-making, and we loved every second. Your parents saw it as noise, but you knew better. It was a weekly escape from school, chores, and whatever sadness the week might have brought. Those mornings felt endless, like time itself was bending in your favor. The television glowed with color and hope. And as the final credits rolled and the sun climbed higher, you held on to those last cartoon moments like a secret handshake only kids understood. A countertop garbage chute might sound like science fiction, but it was once the definition of practical design. Picture this: a hinged square in the middle of your kitchen counter that popped open to reveal a direct drop into the trash bin below. You could chop carrots, peel potatoes, and then sweep the scraps in one motion. No fiddling with a trash can lid, no extra step. Just a quick flick of the wrist, and it was gone. In mid-century kitchens, these were genius, especially when you were making big meals and needed all the counter space you could get. It made cleanup feel like part of the flow, not an afterthought. One swift motion and the mess was gone before it had time to become a problem. But eventually, people began to worry about smells, pests, and hygiene. Builders stopped including the feature, and home cooks grew wary of having an open hole in the counter, even if it had a lid. Most of them were sealed shut or removed entirely during remodels. Today, you will only find them in untouched kitchens from the 1940s or 1950s. They are almost always covered in laminate or chrome trim, like a forgotten piece of spaceship tech. What other clever shortcuts have we erased without even realizing it? Avocado green and harvest gold were not just colors, they were declarations. Open any refrigerator, oven, or blender in the 1970s, and you would find these bold, earthy hues staring back at you. They were not subtle, they were not sleek, but they were everywhere. Kitchens did not look like laboratories back then. They looked warm, lived in, human. These appliances matched the shag carpet, the dark wood paneling, the linoleum that curled in the corners. But more than their color, they represented a specific dream. A dream of the modern American family, self-sufficient, stylish, and optimistic. They made your kitchen feel alive, even when all you had was boxed cake mix and powdered milk. You were not just making dinner, you were living in a palette that promised better days. The colors came from nature, or at least someone's memory of it. They were meant to calm, to ground, to connect. Now we call them outdated. We ripped them out during remodels, but at the time, they were cutting edge. If you grew up with an avocado fridge, you can still picture it humming in the corner, stocked with soda in glass bottles and leftovers wrapped in foil. These machines outlasted their trend. Some still work. What does it say that the appliances lasted longer than the dream they were sold with? Going to the movies in the 1980s was not just an outing, it was an initiation. You did not just watch Back to the Future. You traveled in time. You did not just see E.T., you believed in aliens, friendship, and flying bikes. The Goonies made treasure hunts seem plausible in your own backyard. Ghostbusters had you checking every closet for slime. These were not just movies, they were portals, promises, and rites of passage. Every frame was burned into memory, every line quoted in playgrounds and lunchrooms. Blockbusters were not about selling tickets, they were about shaping imaginations. They gave us John Williams scores that made hearts race and Spielberg visions that made magic feel real. Crowds lined up outside theaters, popcorn in hand, hearts pounding. Parents, kids, teens, they all came together in the darkness of a movie theater to be transformed. These films were louder, brighter, funnier, and somehow deeper than anything that came before. And when the credits rolled, you did not leave the theater the same person who walked in. You left dreaming, you left changed. The movies of the 1980s did not just entertain a generation, they raised one. Before open concept became the norm, the kitchen pass-through window was the perfect compromise. It was a small rectangular opening in the wall, usually with a sliding panel or shutters, that connected the kitchen to the dining room. You could serve dishes straight through, peek out to check on guests, or whisper a message without leaving your post at the stove. It was functional and a little bit fun, like a drive-through for your own home. Kids loved it because it felt like a secret door. Adults loved it because it saved steps. These pass-throughs became iconic in mid-century ranch homes and suburban houses. But as walls came down and kitchens turned into wide-open living spaces, the humble pass-through lost its purpose. Some were plastered over during remodels. Others became awkward holes in drywall with no clear use. But once, they made kitchens feel like command centers, like you could be in two rooms at once. What did we gain when we knocked down those walls? And what subtle joys did we lose? Simon was not just a toy. It was a test of nerves and memory, disguised in flashing lights and beeping tones. The rules were simple, but the pressure was not. One wrong press and it all reset. And yet, we kept playing. In the late 1970s, the Simon electronic game became a staple in every toy aisle and nearly every household. Kids sat on shag carpets, palms sweaty, trying to remember just one more color. Red, blue, green, yellow. Repeat. Again. Faster. It was one of the few toys that made your heart race without even moving your feet. It trained your brain while tricking you into thinking you were just having fun. It turned boredom into obsession, competition into ritual. Siblings fought over turns. Friends bragged about high scores. It was not digital in the way we think of today. It was tactile, sensory, and intensely human. And the sound it made when you failed? That descending tone? It still echoes in some of our heads decades later. Simon was one of the first toys that felt like it talked to you, not in words, but in rhythm and repetition. In a way, it was training us for the future. And we had no idea. What happens when a simple game leaves a deeper mark on our memory than most of our childhood conversations? If this took you back, hit like, drop your favorite memory in the comments, and subscribe before the ice cream truck disappears.